Happy first day of March, everyone, and welcome to episode 25 of the Southern Conservative Podcast. My name is Ty. There will not be a podcast tomorrow to make up for a lack of a podcast yesterday. The next podcast will be out on Monday. I first want to discuss the Second Amendment. I want to discuss the history of it. Why is it that it's in the Constitution in the first place? Why do we have a Second Amendment? I hope everybody got a chance to listen to Wayne LaPierre's speech this year at CPAC. He spoke just before Mike Pence did. LaPierre, by the way, is the CEO of the NRA. One of the things he said in this speech is, and I'm paraphrasing, he said that if the Second Amendment goes, our other liberties are at risk. Now, some people will say that that's insane, and that if all guns were banned and confiscated by the government, there would be no need to worry. There would be no need for the people to rise up against the government. Really? Well, let's go back to the American Revolution. When you look at the whole of human history, it really wasn't that long ago. In 1776, the United States declared itself independent from Britain. This was more than a year after the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. Those battles would be the start of a war that wouldn't officially conclude until 1783. And the Americans who signed their names to the Declaration of Independence had absolutely everything to lose. They were committing treason and would be executed if the United States had lost that war. Not to mention all of the tyrannical punishments Britain would have imposed on America had the United States lost. Now, at the time, Britain was the most powerful military force in the world, and they found themselves at war with rebel colonists an ocean away. And to compare the Redcoats to the Continental Army, there was no comparison. Many battles were fought with nothing more than a ragtag team of backwoods hillbillies. But the most incredible thing happened. America defeated the most powerful military in the world, and they did it with their own personal firearms. Fast forward to the Constitution. What's the whole point in the Constitution? It not only laid out a framework for how the federal government would be set up after seeing the failures of the Articles of Confederation, but it enumerated the powers of the federal government. The document specifically outlines the responsibilities of the federal government. Remember, the federal government was created by the states, and the states and the people were supposed to hold the vast majority of power, not the federal government. In fact, the federal government's role was more or less to carry out the duties that could not be carried out properly by any one state. Well, today that's been completely turned upside down. Power has been taken from the people and the states and has been given to the federal government. I mean, what part of our daily lives is not regulated by the federal government? So after the Constitution was ratified and the first Congress met, what did the first Congress do? They passed the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Actually, they passed 12 amendments, but only 10 would be ratified almost immediately. One concerning the compensation of those in Congress would not be ratified until 1992, and one amendment concerning reapportionment was never ratified. But anyway, what became the Second Amendment, the First Amendment behind the freedom of speech, religion, press, and so on, had to be pretty damn important since it was number 2. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The members of the first Congress adopted the Bill of Rights in order to reinforce the idea that the Constitution is what constrains the power of the federal government. There were many who felt the Constitution did not go far enough to protect individual liberties. So to make extra sure that it did, you had the Bill of Rights. These are rights the government cannot take away from you. They are a list of promises made that certain rights would be guaranteed and the federal government would not take those rights away. You see, the framers of the Constitution were well versed in history and well versed on previous experiments in democracy and republicanism. Why did the great empires of Rome and Greece fail? One reason is too much centralized power. Another reason is the corruption of morals, but that's another topic for another day. So why would the First Congress feel the Second Amendment to be so damn important? Well, by this point in time, it had been less than 10 years since the end of the Revolution. And those first members of Congress realized what it took to win American independence and to make all of this even possible. It was Americans arming themselves and using arms to defend their liberty against a tyrannical government. In fact, the Second Congress passed a statute in 1792 that required all able-bodied white men between the ages of 18 and 45 to be enrolled in a militia. Within 6 months of enrolling, it was a requirement that you had to own guns and ammunition. I encourage the listeners of this podcast to read more about the Second Militia Act of 1792. Folks, in the early days of the United States, it was a requirement that you owned a gun. And now, we have people who would like to see guns banned altogether. Now, I give you that history so you can understand the importance of the Second Amendment. Yesterday, President Trump had a discussion with lawmakers about what to do to make schools safer. And at first, the discussion was great. The president said that 98% of mass shootings since 1950 have taken place in gun-free zones. Well, imagine that. If someone really wants to cause death and destruction, are they going to shoot up a place where they know someone will have a gun pointed back at them? Or are they going someplace where they know people will be unarmed? But it wasn't long before the discussion went way off into liberal land, and frankly, folks, I am very disappointed in the words I heard coming out of President Trump's mouth. The more I heard of the discussion, the more upset I became. At one point, he scolded Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania for not wanting to raise the minimum age to purchase a rifle to 21 because Toomey is afraid of the NRA. Those were the words of President Trump. Now, folks, honestly, I'm getting tired of talking about gun control. But since the president is the one talking like a liberal, I'm compelled to say something. Not wanting to raise the age to 21 isn't about the NRA. It's about the Constitution. Are you telling me that the Second Amendment guarantees different rights to someone 21 or older than to someone younger than 21? Because I can't ever recall reading about that in the Second Amendment. The fact is, folks, you have many 18, 19, 20-year-olds out there who are abiding by the laws of this country, working, paying taxes. They may be living on their own. They may have already started their own families. But they cannot have access to a firearm to defend themselves or their families. We will send 18-year-olds overseas to war, but we won't allow them to purchase a gun in the United States when they come home? That's absurd. Young people will still be able to get their hands on a gun. Arbitrarily setting the minimum age to purchase a gun at 21 will not stop the next shooting. Then the president said he will write out bump stocks and that legislators don't have to worry about including this in a bill because the president will write it out. Now, I will give you that a bump stock is not a firearm. It's an accessory to a firearm. But there are many, many bump stocks out there in existence. And if you really want to, you can make your own bump stock. You don't need to buy one. And all this talk of the president just writing an executive order and not needing Congress to pass a law sounds a lot like how President Barack Obama operated while he was in the White House. Then this was probably the most disturbing statement the president made. It concerned those with mental illness. Now, as I've said before, just because a person has a mental illness does not make them more likely to commit a mass shooting. In fact, there are very few conditions in which a person would be more likely to kill others with firearms due to a mental condition. Vice President Mike Pence had mentioned how if we want to go through the process of taking away firearms from someone deemed to be mentally ill, you need to go through a court and get approval to remove guns. And President Trump spoke up and said you can take away the guns first and go through due process second. Are you kidding me? The president cited the court process as being too slow, and if you need to remove someone's guns now, you need to do it. Then set up a system in which people can bring emergency petitions before a court. But you can't throw away someone's due process rights as you're trying to throw away their Second Amendment rights. I mean, we might as well take the Constitution and just run it right through a shredder. Can you imagine a court determining that you are mentally ill or that you no longer have the capacitance to carry or own or operate a firearm, and so your firearms are going to be confiscated and the only recourse you have is to go through the court process? There are some real constitutional problems there. If we're going to start banning weapons from those with mental illness, the terms need to be very specific. Specific medical conditions need to be included. You need to determine which medical personnel should be included to make a diagnosis. I mean, this can really create a real mess. I'm not saying that it cannot be done, but there can be a constitutional way that protects due process rights while also protecting the public. But it's something that lawmakers will have to study closely and not just hastily throw something down on paper. Certainly, if you're able to spot someone who has a severe mental condition, again, that condition would have to be defined on a background check. Then I have no problem not selling a gun to a person who is deemed to be a possible threat due to their mental state. But specific conditions and parameters will need to be defined. If you look at the Florida shooter, he made all sorts of threats about wanting to shoot people or becoming a professional school shooter. When you have clear evidence that someone is making threats against another person or against a group of people, or if you have someone who is making terrorist-like threats, law enforcement needs to step in. Look at how many times the ball was dropped, either by the FBI or the Broward County Sheriff's Office. The warning signs were there, but they were not followed. In this case, it's separate from mental illness and witnessing someone with bizarre behavior. You have actual threats being made. So all of this will have to be carefully weighed when trying to come up with legislation to protect students in schools. As I've said before, if you want to protect students, you need to have armed personnel on site that can take out a shooter once a shooting begins. You can't wait for outside law enforcement to show up. Most times the shootings are already over. You need people ready to go right now. You need guards at entrances, and you need to beef up security at entrances by conducting backpack searches and checking IDs. You need to find ways to prevent shooters from entering buildings and have a way to identify weapons before they make their way inside. But if a shooter manages to get a weapon inside a school, having armed personnel inside makes it easier to take out a shooter once someone starts firing. I will make a point about school districts debating whether to have armed personnel on school premises. For those schools who choose not to do so, you may be putting the lives of students at risk. I say this because you are basically broadcasting to the world that this is a gun-free zone. Well, that's fine to have a gun-free zone if you're a law-abiding citizen. Those who follow the law and don't want to do harm to others will not take a gun into the building. But those wishing to kill others will ignore that rule. And once a shooting occurs, what are you to do if no one else has a firearm that can stop a shooter? As Wayne LaPierre has said before, the way you stop a bad guy with a gun is with a good guy with a gun. Well, folks, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this short podcast, and I hope you take the time to ponder on what I had to say about the Second Amendment and about the gun rights that people have. I'll be back with another podcast on Monday.